Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our afternoon presentation focused on investing in infectious disease. We've got a great panel lined up and indeed a presentation with some fantastic stats and data on this topic. Please do continue asking your questions. To the right-hand side, of course, you'll have the Q&A and chat functions. We'll be able to sort of get to your questions, answer live, and continue the conversation both live and also throughout the event. So please do keep asking those questions and continuing the conversation. But for now, delighted to hand you over to our host and moderator and presenter for today's session, Cody Powers. Cody, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet all of you here today. Like Josh mentioned, my name is Cody Powers. I'm a partner with ZS Associates. I'm based out of our New York office in the U.S. In normal times, I spend the majority of my time and attention on M&A, business development, licensing, and a lot of early pipeline-related issues. But over the last year or so, I've led our team at ZS, our Center of Excellence, as we call it, focused on COVID vaccines and therapeutics, and as kind of extension of that, also part of our broader vaccine vertical. I think we had kind of tossed around ideas about how infectious disease might change, I think, coming out of the pandemic. I think if you look historically, an area perhaps where you could argue that there's been significant underinvestment, some of which is perhaps borne out over the course of the COVID pandemic. So I think today's topic is about the extent to which the pandemic essentially is a transformative moment, potentially, for infectious disease, and things that we think, I think maybe more acutely would persist post-pandemic and essentially change the orientation of the infectious disease landscape. That could be from an investment perspective, clinical development, commercialization, partners, and so forth, versus things that are not going to change, things that perhaps have been issues all along and therefore would persist even post-pandemic. Today we'll kind of step through a short presentation first to orient around some of the issues, and then we've put together a panel here of experts to help us kind of dissect the nature of infectious disease, both historically, some of the challenge that people have faced and are seeking to address, and the extent to which a lot of our panelists feel that things would change coming out of the pandemic versus things that would remain relatively similar. So just so we're all oriented today here on a common set of facts, we've kind of broken down the infectious disease world based on the nature of pathogens. So broadly speaking, 4 major sets of pathogens: bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. Obviously, the lion's share of attention in general, even pre-pandemic, would have been oriented around bacteria and viruses. But I think important to remember fungi and parasites are also part of the equation. So you can see, obviously, with clinically, some of the clear differences that are between us. I'm not going to go kind of one by one here. I think it's important to understand that there are significant differences depending on what type of pathogen that we're talking about. So, for example, on the bacteria side, obviously a lot of the development effort historically is about antibiotics and addressing resistance. And I think more acutely, that novel development is very focused on how do I preserve that essentially one in the holster, if you will, for the most difficult to treat cases, later line treatments, resistance, and so forth, versus something like viruses, where a lot of our time and attention is on prevention, right? That's on vaccines, and even in a COVID sense, there's passive immunity-inducing agents. So I think that's part of what we'll kind of talk through here today, that the nature of infectious disease is not uniform. It is very different depending on the type of pathogen that you're talking about. And that in some ways, the policy and commercialization and investment related implications here could be very different depending on which of the 4 verticals here that we're talking about. So I think it helps to start with the nature of the development landscape historically. Maybe on the top chart, just to orient you here a bit, what we've done is compared the number of new trial starts depending on which category we're talking about. Obviously, they're broken down here by geography, trials that were started in the US, Europe, both US and Europe. You can see historically, relative to other hot investment areas in biotech and pharma, CNS, neurology, oncology, et cetera, that infectious disease historically lags behind these 2 areas. So just as an example, the average run rate of the last 5 years or so prior to the pandemic was somewhere in the range of 50 60, 70 trials a year started in the US, and then maybe slightly higher if you included Europe. You can see that the number essentially trampolined fivefold, something close to fivefold, during the pandemic period of 2020. Obviously, as you'd expect, the lion's share of that is due to COVID. So, just as a rough marker, over 85% of the of trial starts in 2020 were viral infections, so predominantly COVID related. To put that in comparison, if you look at CNS neurology over the course of the period, usually a couple hundred trials a year started in the U.S., slightly less than, or about half of that, I should say, in Europe, and then in oncology, something close to 600 or so a year in the most recent years. COVID development isn't quite on the pace of oncology, so I think maybe there's some clear distinction there to say that it didn't take over the world to this extent at which that we know oncology dominates development today. But the fact that it would be significantly higher than CNS neurology, I think, puts it in perspective as just the raw surge in development activity that occurred over the course of the pandemic period. So, of course, the question mark is 2021, 2022, beyond. Does it stay like this? Does it kind of come down and go back? I think that's what we're here to kind of focus on today. If you look at it from the perspective of approvals and commercialization, you can kind of see the bottom graph there, that historically through 2020, even including the pandemic period, that the lion's share of development in oncology obviously nets at a higher number. I mean, you kind of expect that based on the number of trials. But I think it is surprising that even though the number of trials in CNS and neurology is much higher, the number of approvals isn't necessarily that dissimilar. And if you take COVID into account, obviously there weren't a lot of approvals per se, really just remdesivir from the standpoint of full approval. So I think that's worth noting, that while we see this huge divergence in development landscape, in terms of the number that actually make it to the finish line, actually it's not that dissimilar from CNS neurology. And there's reasons for that that we'll describe here in a minute. From a funding standpoint, if you looked at earlier stage funding, this is historical data, so not including the COVID period. Obviously, oncology gets the lion's share of attention here, but you can see, historically that relative to the size of the impact of infectious diseases, we've all seen that infectious disease funding is comparatively small. And I think that kind of posits the whole market challenge. Are companies being funded appropriately relative to the unmet need that's on the table? If you look at it from an IPO standpoint, it's not quite as stark a difference, but there's clearly a difference there, right? So 21 IPOs over a 5-year period, as opposed to CNS neurology about 50% higher than oncology over 3 times higher. In terms of exits, if you look at just raw transaction count first, I think if you include versus exclude the COVID period, you get to a very different picture. So infectious disease courtesy, I think of COVID, that essentially last year you saw cresting over 400 transactions, over the last 4 years. But the majority of those were COVID related deals. So you can imagine these are a lot of earlier stage deals, essentially trying to find platforms that would either be reused, largely reused from other viruses, or a handful of novel early stage platforms developed specific to COVID. Certainly pales in comparison to oncology, but I think in the transaction sense, last year closed the gap quite a bit with other areas like CNS here, one of our comparators. If you look at where deals historically have been before COVID, that about half of deals are focused on viruses, a little bit less, and the majority of the remainder are bacteria, and that by comparison, fungi and parasites obviously much smaller. I think what's worth noting on the deal values, that you get kind of a bifurcated picture. So an average deal, at least of the deal set that we looked at here in infectious disease, is smaller on average than CNS neurology or oncology. The COVID period is a little bit of an outlier, because you can imagine there's just a lot of assets with lacking data, right? So by virtue of how quickly things happen, people are making much earlier decision choices, and so you'd actually expect the median value to go down quite a bit. That may not be indicative of a long-term trend. We think that's more just driven by the nature of the assets and lack of data, given the speed of the period. So what are some of the challenges historically that have made the space difficult, at least in the eyes of those, and you'll hear from our panelists shortly, who participate in the space? I think there's a couple here that we've keyed in on. There are many others, which I'm sure our panelists will help illuminate. One, the extent to which commercialization incentives exist. So if you look at the nature of incentives that are offered by governments, there's a lot of incentive behind development. I think, as you'll hear today, push incentives, if you will, from the development side, but not as much pull through on the commercialization side. So that becomes a challenge, because essentially then there isn't enough reason to participate in the market. It can't just speed up development timeline. It needs to be sustainable from a company's perspective. Two, obviously concerned about resistance, most acutely for bacteria, but also for the other agents, other types of pathogen as well. And that there's a bit of a bifurcation here, right? Usually when we're talking about life sciences, we're trying to get more and more people to use the product. But in the case of resistance, we're actually trying to decrease use or reserve use. So that creates a bit of an economic challenge, obviously, for companies. Last, that the benefits to these agents and to prophylactics as well can be more beneficial to society than just the individual, right? The nature of infectious disease means if I'm prevented from being infected or treated, I prevent the next person from being infected. So whether or not essentially the model is pricing in that benefit often can pose some challenges for companies. How did COVID change things? So a lot of different dimensions. So one, obviously unprecedented funding surge. Two, the technology used. I mean, I think even the vaccines are probably the best example of this over the pandemic period, certainly the neutralizing antibodies as well. Just kind of breakthrough stuff that I think a lot of people never thought really possible. Of course, much of the driver is just the size of the unmet need, the fact that across the globe, obviously everybody's in the same boat, but also met by the reality of regulatory agencies, the need for flexibility, right? Just the nature of recruiting for trials in a very tight period to be able to execute on that, that it wasn't necessarily the same protocol as would have been followed pre-pandemic. So I think going forward, if you think about how things might change, some of it you could try to quantify even in pure economic terms. Why should we change? Well, the pandemic has shown more than anything else that a major infectious disease outbreak has, if nothing else, significant economic consequences. So here, we looked at a decrease in year-over-year GDP just as kind of a rough marker. I mean, these are obviously trillions of dollars, US dollars at play here. And so even from a public health perspective, perhaps the extent to which things change is just illuminated by raw productivity, even if you put public health aside here. If you look at the bottom and just how much funding has gone into even just the manufacturers of the vaccines here, roughly 1.8 billion in vaccine funding. Obviously, in normal times, that would be a significant public health investment, but relative to the size of GDP loss, I mean, I think the ROI hopefully is clear there, both from the public and for private interests. So how can we start to think about making this in perpetuity? How would some of these things change long term? I'm going to quickly run through these, and our panelists will kind of jump in here in a minute. But to kind of put it in broad terms, financially, things would need to change, and infrastructure-wise, particularly supporting commercialization, things would need to change. So one, some of the ideas that have been tossed around, how do we subsidize R&D in exchange for product pricing? So again, solving for kind of the pull-through effect, looking at different patent term extensions. They're different today than some of the LOE extensions you get for pediatric use, et cetera. Of course, government plays a role in the COVID period. Would government fund increasing efforts on discovery? Would the government as a whole or public health agencies be responsible for purchasing these agents, and therefore not just relying on some of the failures of the private market that we've talked about historically? In terms of infrastructure, you could imagine a lot of interest in new technologies now. I think mRNA and frankly, the ability to use mRNA to respond rapidly has opened a lot of new possibilities there. Two, the idea of open source type of collaboration. Some people may be aware of one that's run by Harvard, MGH, here for companies collaborating open source that really you wouldn't have thought about historically in R&D period, never mind in an area that was underfunded. And then three, some of the basic investments in manufacturing. So clearly part of the vaccine story here, and limited extent, maybe even neutralizing antibodies, is a lot of early government funding to get more manufacturing capacity off the ground. You could imagine doing more there to help companies get their first dose out, if you will, as opposed to subsequent doses as well. So we're going to transition here and introduce our panel. Just quickly kind of showing profiles here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to allow our panelists here to introduce themselves. So I'll kind of go around the horn here, just in order of people that are on my screen. Neil, would you mind kicking us off?
Thank you. Yeah, hi, Neil Clark, CEO of Destiny Pharma. So we're focused on developing our XF platform for the prevention of infections, including MRSA after surgery. And also we've recently acquired a phase 2 package, which is going into phase 3 next year for the prevention of recurrence of C. difficile infections. And we have an earlier pipeline as well, including a COVID-19 government-backed project here in the UK. So very focused on infection prevention and interested to participate today.
Thanks, Neil. Andy.
Hi, Andy Parrott, currently VP Commercial Planning and Operations at Karuna Therapeutics, which is CNS, and obviously not involved in anti-infectives. But prior to this, I was at Acaogen, which was a small biotech on the West Coast in the US that brought a new aminoglycoside into the market. In the last few years, I've been involved in antibiotics on and off for 25 years of my career in both the antibiotic side and the antifungal side with companies like Bayer, Schering-Plough, and Sanofi-Aventis. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Andy. And Christine.
Yes, nice to meet you all. I am Christine Baker, currently Chief Business Officer at HOOKIPA Pharma. At HOOKIPA, we have an arenavirus-based platform, which allows us to have prophylactics as well as therapeutics in the anti-infective space, as well as oncology. So we have a phase 2 asset that is directed as a prophylactic against cytomegalovirus. I've also had prior experience in anti-infective development, research, and commercialization at a number of large pharma companies, including Schering-Plough and Novartis.
Thanks, Christine. Maybe just to start our discussion out, I'd like to go around the table here and have each of our panelists talk about what they think the biggest challenges are historically that have impacted both development and commercialization of new assets for infectious disease. Maybe just to go in reverse order here, Christine, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. I think that for me, the number one thing is ROI. When you sit in a biopharma organization, if you're small and you're trying to think about the return on your investors, or if you're large and you're thinking about you've got a big multi-billion-dollar R&D budget, but you eventually want to be able to commercialize those assets, you have selections, you have choices to make always. And for anti-infectives, the business case is often very challenging to make. I know we'll talk a little bit more and expand on sort of present day situation, but I would say, putting our present pandemic aside, anti-infectives has been challenging from that ROI calculation.
Andy?
Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation. That goes to multiple areas. I think you touched on one of the limiters that I think rightfully so, people are concerned about resistance. So, this is the one area of medicine where there's a concern of how do you manage for the benefit of the herd versus the individual. And I think that that makes people wary of utilizing new drugs. There's a lot of excitement to have new classes and new agents available, but not necessarily to use those agents. So I think that there is a lot of innovation, but that innovation doesn't necessarily result in innovation or reward for commercial entities that are bringing those products to market, because they're being reserved because of stewardship concerns.
And Neil?
I'd agree. I think the points have been made, and it builds into a story of from investors' viewpoints as where the phone is put down, it's not been considered an attractive space, and it's obviously facing hopefully a massive correction now on the facts, the harsh facts of the pandemic. But anti-infectives perhaps have often been undervalued. I mean, this is in many cases an infection can be removed and your recovery is 100%. You're not, it's not necessarily in all cases, but you're not talking about life extensions or managing an illness. A targeted, effective anti-infective over the century has delivered elimination of something, and this is perhaps a holy grail of medicine. So hopefully well placed to bounce back in unfortunate circumstances, but we must seize the opportunity.
Yeah, Cody, if I could expand a little bit, I also think beyond the challenging economics, as Andy mentioned, if you're really successful with the development, you might be the least likely to be used. So that's kind of a, generally not the connection you're looking for. But I also think that sometimes the greatest needs are in the places that are have the weakest commercialization prospect. And I think that there's a very, very basic imbalance where your normal, let's call it capitalist driven system, doesn't really address the needs that you have from the medical advancements.
Maybe to jump in on that, I think there's an argument, and I think it's perhaps being demonstrated with what's happening with COVID, that anti-infectives writ large could be thought of more as a utility and something that governments should have a larger hand in terms of supporting than any other area of medicine. They kind of form the foundation of all of modern medicine, whether it's on oncology or surgery. But they, as Neil said, they're also the unsung heroes because people tend to forget about them.
So maybe to build on that, and maybe Neil, this question for you: what are some of the limitations of private industry or private interests that you feel like may not be captured right now by the broader market, or the nature of commercialization in the space that may not be recognized?
I think from as a public company, I mean, investment obviously is required. So just going from, that, as I said, a simple overview of being, an unfashionable space, and perhaps this is more in anti-infectious bacterial. I'm not such an expert in antivirals or antifungals. I think antifungals is neglected as well, but there are themes where obviously if you're a fund manager, you're assessing your ability to make returns on your investment, and the harsh reality is, and that's how pharma companies look at it internally, as was said by Chris. It's been hard to point to examples of where you can make a better return. Immuno-oncology, orphan drugs, rare diseases, have boom time. Having said that, many of those conditions are associated with infections. I was at a presentation just a year ago at the start of the pandemic here in the UK. A cancer surgeon from the Oxford group of hospitals, talking about the problems of post-surgical infections after partial tumor removals or operations, where people can't move on to chemotherapy, radiotherapy, because if there's an infection present, of course they're too weak or it's not appropriate. So as was said by Andrew, it affects all aspects of medicine. They're a fundamental tool in the kit, and unfortunately some of the tools have got a bit old, and there's great opportunities to bring forward new candidates. But obviously, as ever, it needs investment, whether it's a public, private, or more likely probably a combination, the way we're going.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the both things that could change and some of the things that could stay the same coming out of the pandemic. I'd like to start with some of the things that we think could change coming out of the pandemic. That could be in terms of investment, that could be development, that could be commercialization, it could be public policy, it could be what private industry pursues. Maybe Christine, I'll start with you here, just given the viral connection. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the observations that you've seen or already felt, or things that you think would change coming out based on the pandemic?
So I think the first thing that I would start with, which I really hope endures, is the information sharing. So the ability and the transparency of having the genome of the COVID-19 virus out there, and then everybody started working on it. That's certainly one early aspect of transparency. I also think that engendered certain expectations about clinical trial information being released in a way which is, relative to historic standards, much, much more transparent than we are generally used to seeing. So I think that transparency is something that is great, and I probably am not optimistic enough to think that that happens everywhere. But I think if we say this is an emergency, even if it's not an absolute worldwide emergency, if it's a significant health crisis, I think that transparency we've shown can really accelerate the development of therapeutics and potentially prophylactics, which are absolutely essential.
What about in terms of investment? So obviously we saw a huge surge in investment in the space here. I guess, Neil, I know you mentioned that last. I'll start here with you. To what extent do you think investment might change coming out of the pandemic?
I mean, I think, again, coming from anti-infective, antimicrobial resistance viewpoint, I think it has been changing, and the pandemic has accelerated that. So there's been a lack of investment from pharma, a lack of commercial partnering, but it has been recognised for a long time. In fact, this week, Matt Hancock, who's the UK's beleaguered Minister of Health, doing his pre-G7 talk, obviously talked about the pandemic and the need to work together with the G7 leaders. But the other healthcare issue he brought up was antimicrobial resistance. So and that's not new. That's been happening. WHO, G7, G20 for several years. But and it has sort of commuted its way through to funds like the Novo Fund, Repair Fund, which is dedicated to, again, this area of novel anti-infectives. And recently, I think it's middle of last year, the AMR Action Fund was announced, which is a collection of pharma companies and other entities they talk around $1 billion of cash in a fund and it's called the AMR, the Antimicrobial Resistance Action Fund, is going to be put to work to support clinical studies. So some of that has been accelerated by the pandemic, but I think some of it was happening anyway. And it'd be really interesting to see more of those types of initiatives, but also perhaps maintain this closer link with government support and perhaps working more in partnership. And obviously we see now the issue, especially in Europe, of AstraZeneca, who are effectively distributing their vaccine at cost. I'm sure there's other benefits for them in other areas in having that sort of pro bono approach and the goodwill. As any big business, there's charitable activities happen more than people realise in all sorts of large companies. But that type of approach in this space, which is not been funded recently by perhaps more traditional private investment, I'd hope that would carry on. But having said that, it would be great that if more classical investors, venture capitalists, and pharmaceutical investors and perhaps corporates could come back into the space, and perhaps that's selfishly, as a listed company, we know in the future to fund clinical development we will need to access funds, and it's great to get grants and obviously partnering, but also it would be great to think that an equity market is there not only for the early stage research, which is perhaps more buoyant with the various push incentives, but also for the later stage assets, and obviously if the quality of the assets is there, hopefully we'll have new drugs and treatments, preventative and otherwise, coming through.
Andy, do you think? Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, I think another aspect that we also saw really very much front and center is regulatory flexibility. Personally, I can't think of any other time where there are so many assets are released under emergency authorization approvals. So, I mean, that almost seems like the standard way to get things approved these days. But much before that, the standards for what you needed to do to get your clinical trials approved, to get your approaches authorized, I think that kind of additional flexibility also, I hope, is something that endures. Again, can't be the standard because it's probably not appropriate, but in situations where we have real definite health needs, which I think is what this panel is talking about, I think that would be very, very helpful to be not to forget that, and to remember that we're, I'm sure, saving hundreds of thousands of lives, if not millions of lives, by virtue of the fact that regulatory agencies got very flexible very fast.
Maybe on that one, I know it's not our main focus here. Do you think, Christine, the change in regulatory approach here would have implications for change in regulatory approach for non-infectious disease assets as well?
So I think if you go back to the 1980s, and obviously AIDS, HIV, that was, I think, really some of the start of how much flexibility we have in the oncology space. But obviously AIDS is a virally transmitted disease. So it really started with an infectious disease that let's call it, was not just contained to large third world populations, right? It was really something that affected the G7, the G20 nations, and people, you know, as we all know, the story of what the activism wrought. Anthony Fauci from the US, who's on TV and in the media all the time, you know, was really forged in the fires of those early AIDS activist days. And then that was translated to, okay, what about populations that really have urgent needs, and looking at some of the additional regulatory flexibility that's for cancer, that exists for orphan drug designations. So I think that you did see that start with a virus, and then we think maybe more about it in some of these smaller populations. So I think it does have the possibility to be looked at in these situations where people say, you know, if you tell the pharma company the clinical trial is going to take you 10 years, it's going to be almost impossible for anybody to sign up for that. So figure out how you can shrink it, because literally, as we all know, time is money, and money is not endless, and money is not necessarily always dedicated towards those anti-infective challenges.
Yeah, I would love to see that regulatory flexibility continue, and you're seeing, you know, smaller data sets and then post-approval commitments, and the acknowledgement that, you know, you don't need to have huge data sets, particularly if you're working in AMR, where you don't have huge numbers of patients, and often those, for other reasons, the patients are difficult to enroll because of their health status at the time you're trying to enroll them. They may screen out because they've had prior treatment, or, you know, getting informed consent at that late stage with a very sick patient is often very difficult from the family. They're difficult studies to run in large numbers, but being more open to using smaller data sets to gain approval and then follow up with post-approval commitments and larger safety databases that are not necessarily in the patient population, I think would go a long way to making this a lot more attractive from an approval perspective.
To build on a little bit what Andy said, I think the other thing that we have as a huge advantage with anti-infectives is you have a very rich set of translational data available. And so the ability for regulatory authorities to be looking at that translational data, which is almost certainly going to come before you have your, you know, clinical endpoints, and to be able to keep that in mind for other, expanding this kind of flexibility and mindset to other areas, I think is something that's very, very easy to do, not just for antifungals, but not just for antivirals, but also antifungals, antimicrobials, et cetera.
So does that include expansion of surrogate markers potentially, not just hard endpoints that come at pivotal stage today?
I think surrogate, when you say a surrogate endpoint, I think that's where the regulators start to get a little bit nervous, because it makes it sound like you're moving something up. So I think if you can start talking about translational data as potentially accelerating some of those pre-approval milestones, and being able to overlap some of those pieces of the development that used to be sequential, maybe can be overlapping. I think that's where there might be an easier adoption from regulatory bodies. Not speaking as a regulator myself, but I think that that's an easier ask.
Andy, maybe to shift gears a bit, let's talk maybe a little bit about commercialization and commercialization changes that could happen coming out. Is there anything that you've seen over the course of the pandemic that would lead you first to believe that things have changed? We'll deal with what stays the same in a minute, but just in terms of things that could change, anything that you've observed?
Well, I think observing, you showed a slide showing the quantum of money that is being utilized in order to combat this threat. A small amount of that could go a long way in antifungals or antibacterials in helping improve the commercial situation. I mean, there have been talks for a long period of time about either delinking the payment for an antibiotic from utilization. So you think about it more as an insurance type model. So, antibacterials are seen as a utility that you need, that you may not want to access for stewardship reasons, So therefore, do you think about it more as an insurance? So you make a fixed payment in order to gain access when you need it. Or you have models like Disarm, where they're looking at, particularly relevantly for the US, where you're looking at taking the payment for an antimicrobial out of the DRG in the hospital setting so that it's not overwhelming the cost of care for the patient. And there's an ability to access modern innovative therapy in a way that doesn't put the hospital at risk for a financial loss. I'd like to see some of that money, once the pandemic is controlled, be focused on properly funding those types of initiatives.
Yeah, just adding that in the UK, they have, I think, pioneering with, so it's taking several years rolling out one of these subscription models, and they've actually announced recently, they've selected the two, I think they're antibiotics. One's a Shinogi compound, I can't remember the names, but they've actually announced the two candidates. What we don't know, or I don't know, is the actual quantum. What's the amount of money involved? What are they guaranteeing to buy for how many years? So in terms of that commercial end game, if you're internally as a pharmaceutical analyst or an investor, you're doing your net present value calculation, what certainty does that bring? Because that's obviously the concept in sort of a pure pull incentive, is it gives some confirmation that there will be confirmed sales, which is perhaps what's been happening obviously in the pandemic. There's been guarantees that if you deliver this, we will buy them as long as it works. So Sweden, I think, is following, and I know the US is the Pasteur Act. So slowly that's coming together. But again, how many novel compounds are able to be supported by such approaches? It's probably only a partial solution. And it'd be interesting to see exactly what's selected, as it were, and the quantums of money. I'd like to think that whether it's sometimes the company's selecting slightly different candidates. Obviously, we at Destiny very much believe in sort of the preventative approach, so that's our way of differentiating. We hate, really, to be honest, to be called antibiotics because it comes with a lot of baggage, which is not fair. But from an investor's point of view, that sort of prevention is better than cure strapline. We think we can get more interest, and obviously the pandemic has highlighted the healthcare benefits and the economic cost of preventing things in the first place. So I think it in various ways, hopefully, it will change the way healthcare is managed by governments. Be it, all sorts of preventative actions, weight loss, out in the fresh air, masks, and hopefully, of course, support and investment and in anti-infectives.
Maybe I know, Neil, you mentioned there obviously the role of government entities. I think Andy, you mentioned the same. Maybe Christine, maybe from an investor perspective, what do you think investors may change coming out of the pandemic with respect towards their attitudes towards infectious disease?
Yeah, I think there's that old expression, right? Follow the money. I mean, there's a huge amount of money that has changed hands in terms of just the direct agreements for purchases of vaccines, as well as if you look at the market capitalizations of some of the smaller companies where the vaccine is more important to them relative to their total portfolio than some of the larger companies. They've increased enormously. So I think that it does change the dynamic, at least short term. As Neil said, maybe the phone is not put down on the hook. Maybe somebody actually takes the call and has the conversation and talks about the business case. So I do think that changes. I also think that the understanding that there could be some enduring governmental private partnership, governmental money is, if you think about it as an investor, it's somebody putting money in, which is kind of amplifies your investment and decreases your risk. So I think that's also quite appealing to the investor community. And last but not least, if you think about how that works in terms of if you have some kind of partnership with the government, it's also great PR. And that gets your company profile out there further, awareness, attention, potentially from other investors. So I think all of that is positive to hopefully changing maybe some of the dynamics that you showed in your presentation in terms of the huge differentials of money being put into organizations that are focused predominantly on oncology versus predominantly on anti-infectives.
So now we'll take off our optimist hats and put on our pessimist hats. Let's talk a little bit about Yep, go ahead.
Cody, before we do that, the one thing we haven't talked about in terms of what's changed and what we would like to see continue would be the investment in diagnostics. And I think that that's very pertinent in antibacterials and potentially antifungals as well. I mean, the system for susceptibility testing for antibacterials has been around for decades and really hasn't changed. There are new companies out there with rapid susceptibility testing to show that, you know, the newer agents are effective against a particular infectious agent. Traditionally, it's taken a long time for a company who's developed a new antibacterial, for example, to get onto those panels and be screened. And it's a bit like, if you're not on the panel and you're not therefore being tested against the isolate from the patient, the hospital or the healthcare provider isn't going to take a chance that you work. And so you don't actually get a chance to be utilized because the data is not there to support you being used. I think increased focus on novel diagnostics and pushing those forward more rapidly would make a huge difference in this area, because it's been a roadblock that people forget about. They develop the antibacterial, the antifungal, and they forget about the diagnostic itself. And the diagnostic is a way of opening the door to utilization.
Yeah, I fully agree with Andy's comment there. And if you look at, you know, the countries in terms of the COVID epidemics and the places that had the diagnostic infrastructure ready to go and able to be utilized, you know, did much better in the early part of those, you know, the exposure to the virus versus places like where I live, where we had at one point a 40% positivity in the state that I'm speaking to you from, mostly because we just had absolutely totally overwhelmed diagnostic infrastructure. We just were not able to test enough people. And of course, it's going to be relevant. I think the world will change in terms of diagnostic platforms and recognition of those, almost as a maybe back to the public utility kind of analogy, in that we need to be able to maintain those as we try to reopen economies and reopen travel within countries, international travel, et cetera. Those things I think will only be possible if we have good diagnostic technologies at the, you know, now, next year, next 5 years, et cetera. And so once those things are in place, then I think it certainly, you know, people should take a moment and say, okay, what else could we be doing with this? Because these will be big investments. And I think, as we've seen in lots of other situations, when you have big capital investments, people get very creative about how to amortize that investment and make sure that it's utilized well.
So let's go back to the I guess my hat analogy. So to put on our pessimistic hats for a minute, not to beat the dead horse too much, but what are some things that we think either would revert back to pre-pandemic levels, if you will, or just haven't really changed during the pandemic and you wouldn't expect them to change coming out? Neil, I'll start with you. What are things in that area that you think would be relatively similar to pre-pandemic?
Well, this is being pessimistic, but investment, the appetite of the investment community in sort of broader anti-infectives, the successes in 2020 specific, you know, in terms of listed companies, again, as was discussed, diagnostics, but they're almost like trading companies. So there's a direct read across to, if they can scale up in the pandemic, it drives through to profits and revenues. It's very tangible for investors in the UK. There's been some stellar performances. But will that read across, as we've been discussing, into a longer term interest in the space? So I'd hope that happens, but concerned that it doesn't, that there's a shorter term focus on the pandemic, which doesn't read across into broader support for anti-infectives. But I must admit, I'm sort of almost pushing myself there. I've actually been having discussions recently with investors, and I'm more positive actually. So I'm actually more positive broadly than have been 3 years ago when I came into this space. So I'm broadly speaking, I'm struggling to come up with negatives, apart from the huge challenge everyone faces in drug development and research. As everyone's learning as they become experts, this thing is not easy, from manufacturing to research to commercialization to distribution, cold chains. It's hard, and so there's enough challenges, but great to have more interest from investors. But I think that is a concern from me as a CEO of a listed company.
Andy, you've probably seen it firsthand more than most, the challenges of commercialization. I guess I'm curious to hear from your perspective, things that you think might be relatively similar post-pandemic.
Yeah, I think, I've been involved in anti-infectives on and off for 25 years, and the commercial realm has not got easier, it's got more difficult over time. I think what concerns me is an aspect of, will we get fatigued, and will people get tired of hearing about, the challenge of infectious disease? They've just lived through a pandemic. Do we really want to hear any more about it when we start branching off and thinking about antifungals and antibacterials, and people are like, no, enough. We've just done this, and that fatigue will feed through, and there will be, despite the fact that we are seeing really encouraging signs on delinkage and disarm and Pasteur Act, and I really like the model that Neil described in the UK, that those things they lose momentum because people are tired and they move on to the next problem. We start thinking about, well, how much debt have we accrued during the pandemic? We start getting a little bit more conservative, and we lose the opportunity to make some of these changes permanent. So that's the thing I worry about.
Christine, are there any others that we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think this global pandemic is one of these opportunities that has taught us truly, of course, how interconnected we are. Last year, this time, we were seeing field hospitals being built in a city in China that I had never heard of before. And they were putting up hospitals, 2 and 3 days or something. And it was just amazing. And then, of course, the virus moved around the globe, and we all became aware of how truly interconnected we all are. I think when you're talking about anti-infectives, where you have a patient with MRSA and they're in a hospital, and that patient's not getting on a plane and bringing MRSA to the city where you are, that interconnectedness and everything else that it engenders breaks down a little bit. So right now, I think if we think about the way the richer countries are considering, okay, we need to get everybody in the world vaccinated against COVID-19, otherwise it's really still going to be a big issue for us. That's not the same when you have the transmissibility differential. And so I think that that's a piece that doesn't necessarily translate so well into the potentially near term as well as midterm future.
So I think maybe to wrap us up on our last topic here, we ended, I think, the presentation with a series of ideas that people have discussed. What I'd like each of our panelists, we could just go around the horn here, to pick on one idea that you think would be particularly applicable. That idea could stimulate investment, it could encourage development, it could address commercialization challenges. But one idea that you think our audience here should entertain, or the public policy makers may want to entertain, to frankly improve the sustainability of the space coming out of the pandemic. Neil, I'll start with you.
I'll pick on one. I think regulatory support, and as Christine raised, maybe closer examination of what happened perhaps in the orphan drug space, rare diseases, and following. I mean, obviously there's things like QIDP and fast track status, but again, sort of being selfish here with our move, hopefully into 2 phase 3 studies in the next 2 years, just really having support for innovation there to perhaps make the studies, as was discussed, more focused and not prohibitive by just being too large and unattractive. So that's I think that's something that regulators could support, and they've shown during the pandemic, of course, that focused minds, there are very creative ways to help drug developers while still keeping vitally important, of course, safety and meaningful endpoints, so that we're delivering data that supports approval and use and hopefully commercial success.
Have you already seen, even in your own observations during the pandemic period, Neil, a change in regulatory attitudes, not just in your own dealings, but just looking around the space?
Well, I think related to the pandemic, yes, but again, I'm not a regulatory expert, so I think it's too early to say. All sorts of things have been fast tracked during the pandemic related directly to that. But does that, as was discussed, does that mean there could be a more open mindset and not just for anti-infectious, maybe for other therapeutic indications to, again, because if a medicine is or a treatment is preventing illness and saving money, then it's a no-brainer, isn't it? The healthcare, the economic cost benefit, the value of life, the utility, it's obvious. But in some cases, of course, they're just extensions and variations. So perhaps those approaches, but for underserved markets, and that includes, the third world, developing world. Again, I mean, I don't know the stats for how many people are suffering from malaria and other indications, which the numbers are probably similar to the magnitude of the pandemic. And are we, we're not discussing those, but there are companies focused in that space, and obviously Gates Foundation. But not wanting to get too above myself, but sort of global health, it's vital to all of us, isn't it? There's no point being rich if you're not healthy. So I think it's quite an interesting discussion philosophically for all of us, which we're facing, and of course some have directly experienced it, I'm sure, who are listening, in terms of their nearest and dearest. It's an unpleasant reminder of how important health is, but it's great in life sciences that hopefully we have the power to address it in our own small efforts as part of the bigger picture.
Andy, one idea?
The idea we talked about a little bit, it's properly funded pull incentives that I think acknowledge and make space for both the antimicrobial agents and the diagnostics, that we pull the diagnostics along with the antimicrobial agents, and they are included in the funding around these pull incentives, so that the commercial environment improves for both the diagnostic players and the biopharma players who are developing the antimicrobials.
Can you talk a little bit more there on the role of public assistance versus private industry, the extent to which you think that it starts with public entities and how they would engage private industry?
Sure. I mean, I think you see a synergistic feedback loop. I think you've seen the push incentives are a good example of public-private. I mean, look at the example of BARDA in the US. Acagium was able to develop plasmamycin because BARDA funded the lion's share of the late-stage development, which really catalyzed a huge leap forward for the company. That level of partnership, if you think about the funding of an insurance type model that actually not only makes an agent available, but addresses many of the stewardship needs, where we want to make sure that we're not overutilizing products, but they do need to be available for the people who would benefit from the products. I think those types of agreements would be hugely beneficial.
And Christine, one idea.
Yeah, so maybe I'll break the rule a little bit and combine two ideas. So two things that we had said relate to government. So government funding, specifically government funding of R&D, as well as potentially contracts that come from the government in advance about purchases. So, prior agreements to purchase some of those. I think both of those things together can help with solving the ROI issue in terms of help, support the investment that's needed to develop, as well as guarantee some market after things are successfully developed. So those would be the thought that I'd like to leave with in terms of government on both sides.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you to all of our panelists. Very engaging discussion today. I'm going to hand off to Josh, who will take us out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cody. And yeah, thank you to Christine, to Andy, to Neil, and to yourself. Really interesting debate and discussion. Probably could have gone on for a lot longer. And I'm sure if there'll be people listening who have follow-up questions and we'll be keen to discuss. So please do keep on with your questions and any comments in the Q&A and chat function on the right-hand side. And indeed, reach out to our speakers and indeed to ZS at their booth in the partner zone as well, if you'd like to connect and discuss any more of these issues. issues. We are back very shortly at 4 o'clock for our afternoon keynote panel, Investment in the Pandemic Era, with a global panel of investors. So look forward to you joining us there. But for now, thanks again to all of our panel, and see you again shortly. Thanks.